Good. Okay. Good afternoon. This is really a reprise of what I did as a presentation for the 50th birthday celebrations. It's slightly altered because one or two of the participants couldn't take place, but nonetheless, we've got contributions from all the people there you see on the screen, and I'm very grateful to them for putting together some very interesting presentations and talking about people and themselves, and giving us a picture of how the group has developed over the years. Okay, off we go. So the group actually started more than 50 years ago now. We're in our 51st year, and the two prime movers, if you like, were Barbara Hutton there on the right and Barry Harrison on the left. They established a group in 1972 on the back of university and WEA classes, and the idea with the group was to actually go around and survey, look at and understand the domestic buildings of North Yorkshire and Cleveland, which was the beginning of the group, and it wasn't till the 1990s that the group actually became complete for covering the whole of Yorkshire. So the kind of thing they were doing was going out, studying buildings, and then they were reporting back in their in the news sheets. There's an example of the first news sheet from 1981. Nice cover, but produced fairly straightforward, and it had the kind of illustrations there you see on the right-hand side. Some quite detailed illustrations, and these contained reports of the various buildings, of the couple of meetings that had been held, and so on. They also contained some kind of interpretation. For example, here we have looking at various different drawings of one sort or another, showing crook blades or roof trusses, and they went out and about. And they went out and about with a vengeance. In some years, they recorded up to 50 or 60 buildings, which today sounds to us incredible. But you have to bear in mind, most of the reports that they produced from these buildings were only 2 or 3 pages long. So on the left-hand side there, you can see them busily recording an ancient building. On the left-hand side, another of the founding people of the group, Tony Solhurst, who for many years was the secretary and held the secretarial role. In the centre, Terry Murray, and then on the right-hand side, we've got Barbara Hutton again. Barbara was a dynamo, a human dynamo. It was something to be reckoned with. And it's said after a while that in Wharfdale, if householders saw her coming up the road, they quickly drew the curtains and things like that. So on the right-hand side of the building, they're actually measuring the prebendal house at Monk Fryston. And on there is the building itself in somewhat earlier days, although perhaps not in quite such a good condition. And there we have more drawings of the time from the actual parental house, showing the building, the plan on the left-hand side, and then some of the roof trusses on the right-hand side. So this was the kind of way the group started off, and it developed for about 15 years or so on those lines, mainly supported by adult education classes and I think it was very important at the time, Leeds University and the external classes that were led mainly by Barry, and Barbara contributed through the WEA and by leading groups around the area. And they quickly established about, I suppose, half a dozen or so groups in various areas in North Yorkshire and Cleveland, and these groups then reported back, let people know what they've been doing, and produced reports. So that's roughly the way that you say the first 15 years of the group ran. Now, here's an inventory, for example, of the kind of documents that were actually used at the time, and that was also part of the thrust of the group, was to bring together documentary sources and the buildings themselves in order to try and get a picture of what the buildings were like, bearing in mind all the various different pitfalls you can have with inventories. For example, there you can see there was a hall, a parlour, a pantry and a cellar, a kitchen and so on. But you have to be very careful when you draw conclusions. Just because the building doesn't appear to have a particular room, it doesn't mean it didn't have it, because inventories are always just recording the possessions of the person involved and not necessarily a record for the building. And that's a kind of a general rule of the documents we've studied. So a lady who was also a member, and who, this is a new bit to the talk, is June Hall, who now is June Hill, following marriage a few years ago. And June was a very active member in the early days, but particularly together with her husband, David. And she has been instrumental over the last 10 years in running a group in Cumbria, the Cumbria Vernacular Buildings Group. So they have a very active program. They have only been going for 10 years. They haven't managed to record all that many buildings. Sorry if hope no one finds that upsetting, but they haven't. And but they have put on a number of study days and a number of very interesting tours and visits and that kind of thing. And there's a good example of an upcoming study day on the 17th of April, all about the hearth. And this will be at an amazing building, if you haven't been there, Nairth Castle, supra vernacular, I think we'd have to say. Okay, carrying on then. Malcolm isn't able to be with us today, but he produced a very interesting summary of one of the lady that he called his mentor. But Malcolm has been a member of the group for many years now, and he has, as was mentioned just now in the introduction, he has got this very distinctive laugh. And I'm sure he won't mind if I tell you a little story about his very distinctive laugh. We had a meeting in Hebden Bridge in 1991, and we were based at this centre in the town. And we sat outside in the evening and chatted about the buildings we'd recorded, as you do, and had a fairly interesting social time as well. And Malcolm's laughs, as the consumption went up, the Malcolm's laugh increased. And of course, if you're in Hebden Bridge and you laugh loudly, it echoes around the valleys. So there was his voice bouncing back the valleys to us as well. And there was one or two little upsets in the following morning, because people had been kept awake by Malcolm. Anyway, his introduction, and I'm going to curtail it a little bit. His introduction was of this lady, Kate Mason. And Kate, another of the, well, not exactly founding members, but she was active in the area. She'd moved up to Yorkshire in the 1970s, married a farmer, and here she is. It's a lovely picture on the left there, holding her bee skep. Behind her, you can see the traditional bee bowls where the skeps were kept. She farmed with her husband at Reynarding on Addingham Moorside, and she became very knowledgeable and was able to bring her knowledge of farming together to the buildings, and so help us understand the ways in which the buildings were used and how you could interpret barns and just understand exactly what was going on. Here's her house. I thought it'd be interesting just to see the building. And there was a visit there in 1997 called Reynarding. And Malcolm had produced this very good drawing of the house itself and showing some of the features, the farm on the left-hand side, and the barn on the right-hand side with a cart entry and the pigeon cote over the top of it. So carrying on then to another member who produced a large number of reports, and one of the stalwarts of the group throughout the 1980s, 1990s and the 2000s, Alison Armstrong. And Alison became an expert in a number of things. She was renowned for her observational powers. Lots of people would stand there looking at a building, and Alison would say, well, you can see this, and you can see that, and you can see the others. And it was only when she pointed it out that pennies started to drop, and you could hear that yes, there is a marking on that crook blade, and oh yes, look at those mason's marks, and oh yes, and things like that. She was wonderful at doing that kind of thing. And I'm not quite sure who took this picture. I think it might have been Arnold Pace's niece, but there they are in a barn. I have to say it's over the border in Lancashire, in Hacking Hall, but it's a marvellous crook barn. And one of Alison's specialities was crook buildings, in particular, interpreting crook buildings, and in particular, interpreting crook timbers when you actually saw it in another building. And quite often when we're going around looking in buildings and that kind of thing, you can see reused crook timbers, perhaps being reused as purlins, perhaps being reused in other ways in buildings of one sort or another. And here is Alison again on the right-hand side there, and on the left-hand side, another of our stalwarts, Joyce Bishop. And Joyce was a member again for a large number of years, and sadly she only died fairly recently. And she'd been a very dynamic lady. Even when she moved away, she used to come back up to Yorkshire to take part in the group's recording events. And you'll already possibly be able to spot one or two of the others who are there. There's Tony Tolhurst on the left-hand side, Kate Mason, who we've mentioned already, there as well. One or two others. Malcolm is here, very young-looking Malcolm Birdsall, and next to him, Barry Harrison. So a fine gathering of folk there at Oldfield, very interesting crook building, with an interesting link there with the crook building. The group then, by the 2000s, has actually developed into the Yorkshire Vernacular Building Study Group, and felt able to actually celebrate the whole thing by a picnic at Markinfield, and actually having a get-together, a social get-together at Markinfield Hall, and better still, accompanied with music, as you can see there on the right-hand side. David Cook and Gunhild there together, producing a bit of musical entertainment. We did do some serious looking at the building as well, but that was a very enjoyable event as well. One or two other members who have played their part over the years. Don McClellan, another of these people who could look at a building in a lot of detail and bring out a lot of information from that. I recorded with him several times, and I was always amazed to see what he could, the things that he spotted and the lengths that he'd go to actually produce very detailed drawings and detailed interpretation reports. He still, I think, holds the record for producing the longest report that the group has done of Crosland Hall, just outside Huddersfield. I took part in the recording with him. It was a bizarre experience. The building was due for conversion, and when you walked into parts of the building, the timber work was in such poor condition that the whole thing swayed under you. Probably something that a health and safety assessment now wouldn't be too keen on, to say the least. Anyway, there he is doing a bit of actual practical hands-on stonecraft work. And Don was archivist for many years, and developed a database on which some of the recording work was entered, and this has now been superseded with the wonderful mapping program and database that David Cook has prepared. Another Joyce on the right-hand side there. This is Joyce Williams from up in the north, up in Gisborough. She attended many of the meetings. She was another old stager. And on the left is John Woods. John was noted for turning up in his motor caravan and having tucked away somewhere a bottle of whiskey. Joyce liked her bottle of whiskey as well. And this is a birthday party because both Joyce Williams here and Joyce Bishop both had their birthdays quite often around the weekend when we had our recording conference, and they were celebrated in the style accordingly. Another member who's a particular talent that he demonstrates is Bob Greaves. He has produced a number of wonderful models, and you can see him there at a meeting there, and displaying in the background. You can see his wonderful models of timber frame buildings, and actually he's brought a sample of oak there along for people to have a hands-on experience with. Bob's models are wonderful because they help you very much to understand how buildings, like particularly timber frame buildings, can be put together. And I think that is very inspiring way to do it. And particularly for someone like me who can't draw a straight line, it's wonderful to be able to see things like that. And for many years, our treasurer was Jackie Cornby, seen here with Barry on the left-hand side. Sorry, it's a bit of bit of a fuzzy number, but it's the best picture I could find of them. And then on the right-hand side, there is Barry holding forth in the main street in Gisborough, and in the centre there, Hannison, who we've seen just now. Good. Well, I'd like to pass over now to Lorraine. Lorraine has been active as the person who's made all the web presentations over the last few years, and has been instrumental in producing and maintaining the group's website for many, many years. And before that, and during the same period, she was the news sheet editor as well. And Lorraine is very active member, still an active member, and she's done her own little piece now. So I shall pass over to her. Well, I hope anyway. Lorraine, over to you then. You're going to chat, are you? And
Thank you, David. Yeah.
Here we go then.
Okay. Hello, everybody. David asked me for a few personal memories. So here we go. This is an image of York, simply because I live there and I'm very fond of it. Next, please. I joined the group in 1993, and coming from the East Riding, I was delighted to find out that the recording conference that year was to be held in Kirby Grindalive at the Field Study Centre on the Wolds. On the left, here is the first building I ever recorded, Clackner Farm. It was a mid-18th century house with a rear wing and farm buildings added to the left. From the kitchen, a back staircase led up to the first floor of the wing and the attic, which was probably a men's room for farm workers. Just across the road was the second building I ever recorded, Orchard House. We recorded two buildings in the same day in those days. Seemingly of brick, but inside some of the interfaces of the walls were of chalk. The brick skin was probably added in the late 18th century. During that conference, Stephen Corns gave a talk on the horse teams which worked big farms on the Wolds. He'd already published a book on these horse lads. And Barbara Hutton spoke on houses and farmsteads. I was put into a recording team with Barbara, who was quite a formidable lady. Fortunately, the team was led by Tony Tolhurst, who was a bit more gentle with beginners. Tony was a very early member of the group, together with his wife, Frida. Tony was secretary for many years and Frida was secretary. Tony died in 2013 and I've always been indebted to him. He was a mentor to me and he introduced me to measuring and drawing and forced me into writing my first report. Because we probably all need a little push to do this the first time. Next, please. I've recorded quite a lot of buildings since then, but I'll just pick out a couple today. I find these two intriguing. They're only 20 odd miles apart and are roughly the same date. They've both been dendro dated, yet the contrast is significant. On the left, Southwood is a smart building with artisan mannerist brickwork, 3-storey porch, a Lombard frieze. Inside there's a posh staircase and other nice interior features. On the right, Glebe Farm is much more humble. It's one of the few crook frame buildings left in the East Riding with walls made of chalk and brick. We recorded this building during the winter and it was one of the most atmospheric and evocative buildings I've ever recorded. I remember being alone upstairs drawing this crook. It was a gloomy late afternoon in winter and you could really envisage what it must have been like to live there, with the box bed on the ground floor, still surviving in part, and a smoky fire under the fire hood. Next, please. But the group isn't just about buildings, it's the members who make it what it is, come rain or shine. Next, please. So I had to think about what makes a member. Let's take a look. Next, please. A member has to be adventurous and intrepid, and you'll see from these images that members will forge a raging torrent to get to a building they want to see. Next, please. Members are well prepared with tapes and pencils at the ready, and vertical measuring poles too. Posing, like David is doing on the right-hand side, is not obligatory. Next, please. Members are resourceful and inventive. On the left here, you can see Barry Harrison on top of the tall gatehouse at Ingleby Manor, using a bundle of towels to weight his tape down. In the middle photograph, David Cook has gathered together a collection of plastic buckets and bricks to raise his laser leveler to the right height. On the right, David again has a homemade device made from a clothes prop to elevate his camera to photograph a taller building. Next, please. I seem to have a lot of photos of people looking at doors. It's not just doors, windows too, and walls, kneelers, hood molds, you name it, members look at it. Next, please. Stuff, other people's stuff. On the left is a crook-framed cottage on the North York Moors, which we recorded. Every beam and joist had mugs and jugs hanging off it. The timbers were low, so if you were at all tall, you were in danger of bumping your head all the time. It was a miracle that we didn't break anything, but I don't think we did. On the right, this was a commercial premises which we recorded, and the owner ran a mail order stationery business from here. There were boxes everywhere, boxes and papers and shelves. It was a bit of a nightmare to measure, but we did it. Next, please. Dark places. Here's Malcolm again, well prepared with his head torch, and he also seems to be trying to get into a pigsty on the right-hand side. Next, please. Beasts. We come across quite a few beasts when recording. Cats, they sit on your drawings, they push against you when you're trying to measure. And dogs are as bad. The one in the middle was totally bemused at the sight of Kevin trying to photograph a ceiling. And as for the dog at the bottom, well, enter that building at your peril. Chickens are also a bit of a challenge sometimes. At the top right, Kevin is trying to photograph a barn, but he got surrounded by chickens. And here is David again, trying to have a sensible conversation with a chicken. Next, please. Members are curious, and that's curious in all senses of the word. They'll hang off canal bridges to try and feel a date on a date stone. They climb up on mounting blocks. And David's very fetching goggles in the middle were actually a health and safety precaution whilst we were using a laser for measuring. Next, please. And last of all, members like to relax and be sociable too. So let's hope the group has many more successful years to come. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Lorraine. That's great. It really gives a good picture of what the group gets up to and what the members do. And just as a warning almost, I mean, how did you manage to catch me in some of those poses? I do not know. Anyway, we're going straight on to a second presentation by one of our long-standing members. And here I'd like to introduce Tony Robinson. He has been instrumental in getting the Yorkshire buildings produced on a regular basis for a number of years now. And him and his the editorial team do a grand job in presenting the work that we've actually produced and to pulling together the various articles that people present and reports to produce, I think, a journal that we can be very proud of. So, Tony, over to you. You just have to tell me when to go and where.
Right, can you hear me?
We
Can you
can.
hear me?
We can, thank you.
Okay, good. Well, thanks for your intro. I was going to say a little bit about how I started, how I became interested in recording buildings. Well, it probably all began at school, where we had a very good geography teacher, Mr. Hughes, and school was a small town in Shropshire, Wellington, and it was a boys' grammar school. Now, this isn't the Shropshire of A. Houseman, the blue remembered hills and all that. It's rather the scrub-covered tip hills of the East Shropshire coalfield. So it's a very different sort of landscape. And it was an area that boomed in the 18th century and the early 19th century, but went into a rapid economic decline as the West Midlands boomed. So you get boom in one place and bust in another. And so it left this legacy of derelict land and ruins. And it was a fascinating area to explore on your bike when you're a school child. Now, the teacher, Mr. Hughes, he used the area as a teaching aid. And one of the visits we made, we went on several field trips with him, was to Colbrookdale, where in 1959, the Abram Darby iron furnace had been excavated by the company that owned it, by Allied Iron Founders. And it was a very far-sighted move on their part, because they'd still got this active iron foundry operating within which sat this furnace. And they were happy to have a sort of open-air display of various products that the foundry had made over the years, ornamental fountains and these African-style cooking pots, for which there was a big demand at one point. Anyway, after school, I briefly went to art school, and this was in the 1960s. And my daughter was well impressed when she found out about this. She said, "Oh gosh, Dad, you were at art school in the 60s." And I said, "Well, don't get carried away, Catherine. You know, it was only Wolverhampton after all." But I soon dropped out from there, and I joined the Ordnance Survey in Southampton. They were recruiting draftsmen at the time and surveyors, and I really wanted to be a surveyor, but they offered me a job as a draftsman. And I thought, well, I'll take it anyway and see how it works out. And anyway, I stayed there a couple of years, learning the ropes, of cartography, Ordnance Survey style. And then I went into the private sector and I joined a private survey company in Worcester, which was much nearer home. And I was able to be a surveyor with them. And this involved traveling all over the country. And again, it was the end of the 60s when the motorway building program was well underway. And there were various regional road construction units, all of which were putting out new sections of road for surveying contracts. And so you'd be working on the M5 down in Somerset and Devon for a week or so, or a fortnight. And then you'd be sent over to Cambridgeshire to work on what became the M11. And then a few days later, you might have to go up to East Yorkshire and work on the M18 and the M180. So what that did, it exposed you to all these different landscapes and building types and building materials across the country. Because when you live in one part of the country, you don't really move around. You think that whatever's around you is typical of everywhere, and it clearly isn't. And we've got a fantastic variety of landscapes, building materials and building types in this country. Anyway, one day the firm just went bust. The bank called in the loan and we were all out of a job. And that caused me to sort of sit back and think, well, what do I do now? And I thought, well, idea, I'll go back to school, as it were. I'll go back to uni. And I took a geography degree. And from then I took a town planning degree. And this takes me right back to school again. And Mr. Hughes, because one of the things he used to say in the 60s, in the glory days of town planning, you boys should get a career in town and country planning. He very much saw this as the future. And so that thought may have lodged in my mind. But unfortunately, by the time I graduated, planning jobs had dried up. So I had to, I ended up in North Wales, and I was working for Clwyd County Council on enhancing the sites and monuments record. So that was a sort of entry into archaeology pure archaeology rather than industrial archaeology, if you like. And the county archaeologist was very active in running a volunteer scheme whereby anybody could come and take part in an annual dig, an annual excavation that he would undertake on sites that were generally owned by the county council, or there was access to them via Clwyd County Council. So that persisted for several years, even after I'd moved up here to Yorkshire to the planning job. So when I did come up here, I looked for a similar volunteer body, you know, a sort of archaeological group. And the nearest thing I could find was the Vernacular Building Study Group, which is interesting. And it was planning that brought me into contact with Barry, because in the 1980s, the developers were sniffing around Thirsk looking for supermarket sites. And there were half a dozen sites in contention, one of which was the old Golden Lion site in the marketplace with its adjacent nursery. And that's when I met up with Barry, and we got into the Golden Lion and managed to get into the roof. Well, I managed to get into the roof because I was a lot thinner than Barry. He could only get his head and shoulders. He could get his head, I think, through the hatch into the roof, but I was small enough to get through. So anyway, that led me into the group, and I became a member. And I have to say, it's been a most fascinating experience, and I've met some interesting and very delightful people. And it really was a distraction from the travails of paid employment. So running through the slides very quickly, this first one of Ingleby Manor, this is one of the 3 medieval roofs that are in Ingleby Manor. It really is a fantastic building. It's probably one of the largest buildings we've recorded, and it was done over a protracted period of at least, I think, 5 years, but David Cook will know just exactly how long we took. So could we move to the next one? Well, one of the features at Ingleby is this carved staircase, which is very fine. But I couldn't decide whether or not it was a reproduction, a 19th century one, or one that's been put together from different parts. I mean, the carving looks pretty consistent, but the handrails and the newel, they look to be of completely different wood and
modern,
possibly different origin. So that was a bit of a puzzle, but it's a very fine feature. Can we have the next one, please? By contrast, this is much more the usual type of building that we get to look at. This is a cottage in Stillington in the Vale of York. This has been derelict for many years, and it's been the source of repeated complaints to the planning authority. Why don't you do something about it? And it was owned by a builder who I think it must be his pension pot. So this is the rear, looking onto the garden. It doesn't look terribly prepossessing. So if we can have the next slide, please, David. Inside, though, it's got this brick hood supported on a Bessemer beam below. This is the first floor. This is in the roof. And being a builder, he's stripped it all out, stripped everything, all the plaster. So in contrast to the slide that Lorraine showed us of the cottage that was full of china and ornaments, this was absolutely free of anything. So it's great when you get a building like this, because you really can see all the alterations, all the structure, all the reused bits of timber. And there was quite a lot in here of reused timber. These beams at the back and these wall plates let into the end, I think they were reused. Part of the stairs have been reused as well. But it was nice to see a complete brick hood built of these narrow bricks, because usually when you do see them, they're all plastered and you don't get much of an idea of the structure. So next one, please, David. Yeah, this is more usual. This is inside Rose Cottage, I think, in Newby Wisk, where they've converted the attic into usable space, but everything has been plastered out. But you can see the form of the smoke hood behind, with the inserted 19th century chimney stack in front of it. So that's an interesting view. And you can see one of the purlins, well, you can see both purlins exposed on each side. So next one then, please, David. This is one of our trips to Beverley, walking around. You can just see Barry retreating in the distance, and we're all crowded around the upper crust, a sandwich shop. I don't think we're waiting to get sandwiches. We're waiting to hear somebody tell us something about the building. So if we can move on, please. The next one. This is another case of recording a building in extremis. This was a thatched cottage in Rydale, not far from Helmsley, at, I've forgotten the name, but it was far enough away from the fire brigade, from the fire engine, to be completely destroyed by fire before the firemen could get to it. So all that you were left with is the cruck frame standing on the outer walls and the gable wall. But again, you know, taking from adversity, it does enable you to see the structure in greater detail than you might otherwise have done. So if we can move on, please, next one. Yeah, this is another cruck building. I think this is the one we recorded on the Barnsley weekend at, I should have made a note of these. I've forgotten what it was called. Birchworth. Birchworth is the village, just north of Penistone. Obviously the fireplace and the chimney are all inserted. And it requires a bit of imagination to imagine how the building would have been when it was an open barn with two opposed entrances. Next one, please. Oh, that's the outside of the same building. Yeah, which has more or less kept its external character. It's built of this very thin Carboniferous limestone in these thin sort of flaggy courses with massive coining at each end. And the central cart entrance has been glazed. And there was an existing window that had been reglazed as well. So the external character has been more or less kept. The internal character is pretty much compromised, but, you know, that's inevitable when you get these barn conversions. You know, people aren't going to live in a single great big room. Anyway, next one, please, Dave. Yeah, this shows the difficulties of trying to rely purely on photography. This is why drawing is so important. This is the property on the left, the whitewashed one, is an adjoining house. It's in separate ownership. And you've got this little access way, which is only about 1 metre wide, along most of the length of the building, the rear of the building. And the only way you can make sense of it is by laying your tape out and drawing it. Photographs simply don't do it justice. But you can see from their altered openings and inserted openings and so on. And there is, I think, one of the feet of one of the cruck members just sticking through at the base. You can just about see that. But all of these details are much better revealed in drawing than they are in photographs. So next one then, please, David. And this is another of our walks. This was Brampton and Lamorthen during the Rotherham weekend. And you can see on the left, you can see Josh Southwell having a hard look, taking a hard look at the building. David as cook is in the shadows having a look at, or taking a photograph, I think, of a little dated inscription that's on the side of the building. And we had I don't think we did any recording at Brampton. We had a walk through on a nice sunny afternoon. Hard to believe this is Rotherham district, but it is. Anyway, next one, please. Yeah, same village, Brampton and Lamorthen, further down the street. And you see what is really a characteristic feature of the villages of this part of South Yorkshire. A great many of them are built, the buildings are built gable end onto the street. And sometimes it's due to the orientation of the village. You know, if it runs east-west, buildings tend to be oriented around that way. But I've noticed it in a number of villages, certainly in the Doncaster area where we were last. In several, there are these gable end onto the street houses, true vernacular houses. So if we can have the next one, please, David. The nearby village of Lawton and Lamorthen, we were able to visit Old Hall Farm at Lawton as part of the Rotherham weekend. We had a visit then, 2018. We didn't actually record it until last year, 2022, when we were able to get back and see the interior of this really fascinating farmhouse. It's a farmhouse, unlike most other farmhouses, in that most of the first floor rooms, the chambers, are panelled in 17th century panelling. And they've got a couple of 17th century stone fireplaces, corbelled fireplaces, which are really interesting features. And the problem with panelling, unless you take a really close look at it and you're really skilled in interpreting it, is whether or not it's in situ or not, because it's such easy stuff to move. And you do see it turning up in all sorts of places. I remember going into the co-op in Thirsk once, having to go look at a planning job, looking at a flat in the first floor. And they had some of the doors were made of old wainscot panelling. You know, it had obviously come from somewhere. This was an 18th century building, so it had come from somewhere else, presumably. Anyway, Lawton, the old farm was interesting. It had, that's the front of it in deep shadow, with the owner standing by the door. It's got these quite a number of mullioned windows, these two-section mullioned windows with hood moulds over, and this stone dormer with another hood mould over. And at the far end, the right-hand end, the parlour end, there's a much bigger mullion and transom window on this side. But on the other side, the garden side, there are 3 or 4 quite large mullion and transom windows, indicating that it was looking out onto a proper landscape garden. And there's a drawing by Samuel Buck, which shows an 18th century house planted on the right-hand end of this, the farmhouse, looking over the garden. And all trace of this later house has gone. It was demolished sometime in the 18th or 19th century, but you can just see in the lawn traces of foundations. So a fascinating site which would repay repeated work. I think it would be great if they could get the archaeologists in to excavate the front garden, the back garden.
Mhm.
Anyway, next one, please, David. I'm not sure how many more there are. Yeah, this is one of our meetings. This is the Rotherham meeting again. This is Wentworth Castle, Wentworth Hall. Anyway, Northern College. We're using this, and they kindly gave us a tour of the building. And this is one of the rather grand interiors, which you don't normally get to see. It's way outside our remit as a vernacular buildings recording group, but nevertheless, from an architectural viewpoint, it's very interesting. So next one then, please, David. Again, I think this is Wentworth Hall again, Wentworth Castle. Another of the fine rooms. I can't remember which one this was. It looks like a dining room. But again, way outside of the vernacular remit, but interesting to see nonetheless. So next one then, please. Yeah, the final one. We're in the library with these wonderful pillars. This pillared frame to the library. You can see quite a few of the members of the group. There's Josh on the right, and I can see Kevin. Graham Steele is there. I think you might be there as well, David, leaning rather casually against a pillar. Yeah. Anyway, next one then, please, David. Yeah, this is our the most recent the Doncaster tour. We're at the old rectory at Campsall, where we were able to see the outside, and we've got this rather fine capped off chimney stack, axial chimney stack. And the main interest of this building is the wing on the left-hand side, which is the first floor hall. And we were able to record the far end of it as part of the Doncaster recording weekend. You can see a lot of members of the group there. I won't run through them. You know who you are. Right, well, next one. Oh, another building recording at Doncaster is Norton Priory Farm. The Priory name is a bit of an odd one, really, because the whole site is scheduled, a scheduled monument. And although it's called Norton Priory, there's no evidence that there ever been any sort of monastic settlement. It takes the name from what English, historic England think was a chantry chapel for the family who owned Norton Hall. Norton Hall was demolished, and this was one of 2 farms built on the site. And this farm, Norton Priory, is still a working farm. All the buildings are in agricultural use, and we were able to record all of them. That was very useful. The adjacent farm, which is called Priory Farm, has been converted to residential use, and it now goes under a number of names. There's Priory Farm, Priory View, or something or other barn, might be Priory Barn, but there are 3 or 4 separate names with the name Priory in them, which is all very confusing. Anyway, next one, please, David. And this, we're coming towards the end. This is the wheelhouse at Norton Priory Farm. Quite unusual. Generally, you get these supporting piers on wheelhouses. They're either of stone or brick, but in this case, they've used these monolithic stone blocks resting on padstones, which are resting it on built-up rubble footings, which is quite unusual. I've not seen one quite like that. Normally, they're of brick construction throughout, and they're, you see them quite a lot in the Vale of York and so on, the lowland areas. And there's Lorraine with her back to us and other people, other members of the group. Anyway, next one, please, David. This again is Doncaster. This is the old customs house at Fishlake, which was a river port in medieval times, and the river has been canalised and diverted. And you'll recall that Fishlake was badly flooded about 2 years ago. I'm not sure whether the village core was affected, whether that was flooded, because this house is in the slightly higher little island with the customs house and the church. The church is a really significant building with this very fine Norman archway, and we were given a tour of the church as well. One thing that doesn't really fit is the date stone on the back of this building, 1630, which I think there's some story attached to it, but I can't remember what that is. David, you're about to say something.
I was going to say the story is that it's a 1990s introduction.
Yes,
we just surveyed that. I led the survey team, so yeah.
Yeah. It doesn't match the building, does it? The date.
No.
Yeah. Anyway, we're back at Campsall. This is the showing the east window or south window into the first floor hall, which we were able to record, and which Roger Lambert has done some super drawings of this, which I hope we can get at least one of them into Yorkshire buildings without too much compression or alteration. There's Sue. She's caught on camera there, flitting across the front. Okay, next one, please, then, David.
You've done.
It's done. Right, well, thank you very much. And
yes, thank you, Tony. Very interesting view of a personal view of the group, and
it's a very much a personal view. Yes,
fine set of buildings. I'm going to crack on now. Thank you very much.
Yep.
I'm going to crack on now because I know it's 4 o'clock, and I know they're anxious to get the AGM started. So only not very long now. Just I thought I should also introduce you to you've met Lorraine already. Then on the right hand side is Pat, who masterminds the membership database. Then you can see also there one or two of the old hands as well on the left hand side there. Again, we're in a Crook building, aren't we lucky? And people haven't really figured all that much yet, but the people that probably keep the group running very much on the left arm is Mary, who you've seen already, and David. And I don't know what they were discussing here. I think they were probably planning their next cruise or something like that, maybe.
Oh,
I
yes.
don't know. Anyway, the group's activities have led to publication of a couple of books. On the left-hand side, the book, as they called it, that Barry and Barbara edited in the 1980s. This book involved something like the first 700 or so reports, and drew conclusions from them, from the reports that have been made and the documentary evidence. And in a similar vein, we've recently published, or David has put together, the timber frame buildings book on Beverley, and an excellent book it is as well, again drawing together these two themes of what you get from the building recording and what you can pick up from the various documentary evidence as well. The group has used a number of venues for its day schools. We pre-COVID, in those days, if you remember, we had an annual day school in March every year, and then the various buildings we've used, some of the sites. The first conference we actually held was up in Dent. And we recorded a number of buildings there, including West Banks. And again, this is contrast between these buildings. And recently, we've been producing some up-to-date photographs of these two buildings, and you can get an interesting idea of what has changed in the buildings. So this is another one, Parks near Dent. And there's a plan drawn by Peter Ryder, in this case, showing various different features of the building. I have mentioned already briefly that the archive that the group holds, we've almost got to 2,000 records. And David in particular, David Cook has done a lot of work on digitizing these records and producing this wonderful digital map on the website, which is a real work of art, and shows you exactly where the buildings that we've recorded, and gives you some information, and better still, links to the database, so you can actually find the report and look at the report that the building you're interested in. I think it's a real boon to research, without a doubt. We've also run courses. Alan Petford on the right there, and I ran a course in Gomersall for a couple of years to, introducing buildings to people. So more or less open to the general public kind of thing. We had 60 or 70 people coming to these classes. Alan sadly died in 2015. Great loss to local history and buildings history in the area. And more recently, we've been in South Yorkshire. And they've had 5 recording conferences, I think, now in South Yorkshire. And better still, there's another one coming up in June, which I trust many people will come to and lend their expertise, and that I think should complete the recording for the moment anyway in South Yorkshire. On the right also you get Peter sitting there examining a mullion in comfort. So that's what I've been told anyway. Okay, in the past, lots of collaborations with local groups of one sort or another. In the centre there, we have when the new fledgling Cumbria group was underway, we did a joint conference with them up in Sedbergh. And then we've worked with various different local history groups, Great Britain, mentioned there on the left, and Long Preston in particular. And I think these kind of collaborations are very, very fruitful indeed. And hopefully the future will be that we carry on with these collaborations, and together with the Vernacular Architecture Group, the National Group, and the YAHS, these are the people who for a long time held our archive, our sort of public facing archive. And the material is held now in the Brotherton Library at the University of York. We're also a member of PLACE, which I think it is more of a natural history group, or it's developed into more of a natural history group, but nonetheless, I think, we still have a place to pay. So, and we're looking hopefully at cooperation with universities. I know that some thematic studies are underway and nearly completed with building reports, completing the South Yorkshire project we've already mentioned, and carry on measuring. Thank you very much.